Everyone knows Soviet pilots flew in World War II, but almost nobody knows the full truth about what happened when one of them went down behind enemy lines. The stories you've heard, the propaganda, the heroism, the glory, they don't capture what was actually happening in those cockpits. What you're about to hear isn't a tribute reel. It isn't a collection of feel-good war stories. It's the real account of why Soviet airmen made one of the most chilling decisions in military history. Why, when their planes were on fire, when the engine was gone, when the controls were shredded and the ground was rushing up at them, they sometimes chose to stay in the burning aircraft instead of pulling the ripcord and floating down into German-held territory. This is not a simple story. It's not even a single story. It's a pattern that repeated itself across the Eastern Front, from the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, all the way to the final months of the war in 1945. And when you understand what was behind it, when you understand what actually awaited a Soviet pilot who bailed out over enemy-held ground, it changes the way you think about courage, about survival, and about what it means to make an impossible choice, with the earth coming up fast and the seconds running out. If this kind of deep history is what you're here for, make sure you subscribe right now. There is a lot more where this is coming from, and you don't want to miss what comes next. Let's start at the beginning. Because to understand why Soviet pilots refused to bail out, you first need to understand the world they were flying into. The Eastern Front was not like any other theater of the Second World War. It was not the Western Front with its rules, its prisoner exchanges, its Red Cross visits. It was something else entirely, something that defied the categories people used to talk about war. The German military campaign in the Soviet Union was explicitly designed, from the very top, to be a war of annihilation. Not conquest, annihilation. The orders issued before the invasion began made clear that the usual rules of warfare did not apply. Captured Soviet soldiers were not to be treated as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. The Commissar Order, issued in June 1941, directed German forces to execute captured Soviet political officers on the spot. And in practice, the brutality spread far beyond commissars. Soviet prisoners of war died in staggering numbers. By the end of the war, estimates suggest that between 3.5 and 5 million Soviet POWs perished in German captivity. That is not a rounding error. That is a systematic slaughter conducted through deliberate starvation, exposure, forced labor, execution, and medical neglect on a scale that staggers the imagination even now, almost 80 years later. The camps where Soviet prisoners were held were not the same institutions where American or British captives were sent. They were open fields surrounded by wire, with no food, no shelter, and guards who shot people for standing too close to the fence. Men dug holes in the frozen earth to sleep in. They ate grass, they ate the leather from their boots. They died by the hundreds of thousands in the winter of 1941 alone. That was the world a Soviet pilot was descending into if he chose to bail out. Not a prisoner of war camp where the Red Cross might visit. Not a processing center where he might eventually be exchanged. A death sentence, slow or fast depending on who found him and what mood they were in. But here is the thing that makes this even more complicated. The threat did not only come from the Germans. The Soviet system, under Stalin, had its own brutally efficient machinery for dealing with men who were captured or who came back from behind enemy lines. Order 270, issued in August 1941, declared that Soviet soldiers who surrendered to the enemy were traitors to the motherland. Not victims of circumstance, not prisoners, traitors, and the families of those men could face consequences too, including the loss of state support and in some cases arrest. Order 227, issued in July 1942, the famous not one step backward order, made clear that retreat without authorization was punishable by death. Blocking detachments, NAKVD units stationed behind Soviet lines, were authorized to shoot soldiers who fled without orders. For a Soviet pilot, this created a situation of almost unimaginable pressure. If you went down in German territory and the Germans captured you, you would likely die. If somehow you survived and made it back, you might still face interrogation by the NKVD, suspicion that you had cooperated with the enemy, and possibly a sentence to a penal battalion or a labor camp. The only truly clean outcome was to go down fighting, to never land in making those decisions in the seconds between a hit and the ground. Because the story of Soviet airmen in World War II is not just a story of political terror and impossible odds. It is also a story of extraordinary individuals who chose to face death on their own terms, and whose choices tell us something profound about the human capacity for defiance. Let's talk about Alexander Pokrishkin. If you know one name from Soviet aviation in the Second World War, it should probably be his. Pokrishkin was born in 1913 in Novosibirsk, the son of a factory worker. He was obsessed with aviation from childhood, the kind of boy who read every technical manual he could find, who built model planes and dreamed of flying them. He got into the Red Air Force through sheer persistence, taught himself to be not just a pilot but a student of aerial combat, analyzing engagements, developing tactics, filling notebooks with observations about how dogfights actually worked as opposed to how the textbooks said they should work. By the time the Germans invaded in June 1941, Pokrishkin was already an experienced pilot, but the early weeks of the war were catastrophic for the Soviet Air Force. The Luftwaffe caught Soviet planes on the ground, destroyed thousands of aircraft in the first days of the campaign, and established air superiority that would take years to overcome. Pokrishkin survived those early disasters not just through skill, but through adaptability, through a willingness to question the outdated Soviet tactical doctrine that was getting pilots killed. The standard Soviet attack formation at the start of the war was a tight three-plane V, an inheritance from pre-war thinking that had become a dead elements, for altitude advantage, for speed and surprise over formation flying. He was, in the early going, not always popular with his superiors for this. The Soviet military system did not always reward men who questioned established doctrine, even when the doctrine was manifestly failing. But he kept flying, and he kept surviving, and he kept developing what became his famous formula for aerial combat: height, speed, maneuver, fire. 4 words that he drilled into his pilots, and that described a way of thinking about a dogfight as a problem to be solved, rather than a brawl to be endured. He said the battle is won before it begins. What he meant was that if you set up the engagement correctly, if you had the altitude and the speed and the angle, the outcome was essentially determined before the first shot was fired. By the end of the war, Pokrishkin was credited with 59 aerial victories, making him the second highest scoring Allied ace of the entire war. He was 3 times a hero of the Soviet Union, the first man in the history of that award to receive it 3 times. He was so feared by the Germans that Luftwaffe pilots reportedly radioed warnings to each other when he appeared, the phrase Achtung Pokrishkin, attention Pokrishkin, becoming legendary. But what the biography sometimes glosses over is the price of those victories, the close calls, the aircraft coming apart around him, the moments where the parachute would have been the obvious choice. Pokrishkin understood what was waiting below. He understood the political system he was operating inside, the suspicion that would fall on any pilot who came back, having spent time in German-held territory. He flew with that knowledge as part of his mental equipment, as real as the altimeter and the gun sight. Then there is Ivan Kozhedub, where Pokrishkin was the tactician, the theorist, the man who changed how Soviet pilots flew. Kozhedub was the pure predator. Born in 1920 in Ukraine, he became the highest-scoring Allied ace of the entire Second World War, with 62 confirmed aerial victories. 62, against the Luftwaffe, which contained some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. Kozhedub flew the Lavochkin La-5 and later the La-7, Soviet fighters that in the later years of the war became genuinely competitive with the best German aircraft, but the machine only explains so much. What Kozhedub had, beyond the technical skill, was something closer to a predatory instinct, a gift for knowing where an enemy pilot was going to be before the enemy pilot knew himself. He had a saying that the pilot who sees the enemy first has already half won the battle, and he trained himself to scan the sky in a systematic way that maximized his chance of spotting threats before they could close. Like Pokrishkin, Kozhedub flew in an environment where going down behind German lines was understood to be, in many cases, a death sentence. The choice to stay in a damaged aircraft, to nurse it back to friendly territory, or to go down fighting in it, was not a mark of irrational bravery. It was, given the circumstances, often the most rational option available. But we need to go deeper than the famous names, because the story of why Soviet pilots refused to bail out is not primarily a story about heroes. It is a story about a system that made certain choices inevitable, and about the thousands of ordinary pilots who flew and died inside that system without ever making the history books. The Soviet Air Force that entered the war in 1941 was in many ways a shattered institution. The purges of the late 1930s had devastated the officer corps of the Red Army and the Air Force. Stalin's paranoia had led to the imprisonment or execution of many of the most experienced military commanders in the Soviet Union, including a significant proportion of the senior aviation leadership. Might be interpreted as sabotage or treason rather than the normal friction of combat. This created a culture of extreme risk aversion at the command level, combined with extreme risk-taking at the individual level, which is almost a paradox but makes a terrible kind of sense when you think it through. Senior commanders were afraid to report bad news because bad news invited suspicion. Junior pilots were expected to succeed regardless of odds, equipment, or preparation, because failure was not an acceptable explanation. The result was an air force that threw men into combat in inadequate aircraft with inadequate training and then condemned them when they were shot down. The aircraft situation in 1941 was genuinely dire. The standard Soviet fighter at the start of the war, the I-16, was a stubby, difficult-to-fly monoplane that had been advanced by the standards of the mid-1930s, but was badly outclassed by the Messerschmitt Bf-109 by the time Barbarossa began. Soviet pilots flying I-16s against Bf-109s were in a situation somewhat like a driver in a 1936 sedan, being asked to compete against a modern Formula car. The skill and courage of the pilot could make up for some of the difference. It could not make up for all of it. And yet these men flew. They flew multiple sorties a day in aircraft they knew were inferior, against an enemy that had been honing its skills in Spain and Poland and France in the Battle of Britain, an enemy whose pilots had more experience, better radios, more reliable engines, and aircraft that climbed faster and flew higher. They flew knowing this. And when they went down, if they went down in German territory, they almost always faced the same set of terrible options. Option 1 was German capture. And here we need to be specific about what that meant for a Soviet pilot, because it was different in important ways from what capture meant for, say, a British pilot shot down over France. A British pilot captured in 1941 or 1942 went into the German POW system, which for Western Allied officers meant camps like Stalag Luft III, with food, mail privileges, access to Red Cross parcels, and even organized escape committees. The Germans treated Western Allied officers in a manner that, while certainly not pleasant and was punctuated by real brutality, at least nominally followed the Geneva Convention. Men were not usually shot on capture. They were not usually starved to the point of death. Some were killed trying to escape, as the murders after the Great Escape of 1944 show, but the baseline expectation was imprisonment rather than execution. That baseline did not exist on the Eastern Front. Soviet airmen shot down over German lines faced a completely different set of expectations. Some were executed on capture, particularly early in the war, when the Germans were still operating under orders that treated all Soviet military personnel as potential commissars or partisans to be dealt with summarily. Others were sent to camps so brutal that survival was measured in weeks rather than years. The mortality rate for Soviet POWs in German custody was catastrophically higher than for any other national group, and Soviet airmen had no particular status that would protect them. There were exceptions, of course. Some Soviet pilots were captured and survived the war in German camps. Some were even interrogated by the Luftwaffe in a relatively professional manner, because the Germans wanted intelligence about Soviet aircraft and tactics and equipment. But the exceptions did not change the baseline calculation. When a Soviet pilot's plane was hit and the German lines were below him, the odds were genuinely against his survival, even if he bailed out cleanly and was taken prisoner in good health. Option 2, beyond German capture, was reaching partisan territory. The Soviet Union had large areas of its occupied western regions where partisan forces were operating, and in some cases a pilot who went down in a rural area away from German units might be able to link up with partisans and eventually make his way back to Soviet lines. This happened. There are documented cases of pilots doing exactly this, surviving behind enemy lines with partisan help and returning to their units. But it was not a reliable option. The Germans were actively hunting partisans and had placed high bounties on information leading to their capture. The population of the occupied territories included both those who hid and helped Soviet soldiers and those who collaborated with the Germans, either from genuine ideological affinity or, more often, from fear or desperation. A pilot coming down in a parachute was visible, and in a village where the Germans were watching, being seen landing could be a death sentence before any Germans even arrived. Option 3 was the one that Soviet political doctrine pointed toward most insistently, going down fighting. Staying in the aircraft, using it as a weapon. And this is where the story takes one of its most striking and haunting turns. because the concept of the Terran, the aerial ram, occupies a unique place in Soviet aviation history, and it tells you something profound about the world these pilots were living in. The Terran was a deliberate ramming attack, in which a Soviet pilot whose ammunition was exhausted or whose weapons had jammed would deliberately fly his aircraft into an enemy plane to destroy it. It was not a theoretical option. It was not a last resort that was grudgingly permitted. It was, in Soviet military doctrine, and in the political culture of the war years, a celebrated act of heroism, something that propaganda celebrated and that commanders sometimes explicitly encouraged. The first documented Terran of the Second World War occurred on the very first day of Operation Barbarossa, June 22, 1941, when Lieutenant Dmitry Kokorev reportedly rammed a German aircraft after running out of ammunition. He was not the last. Soviet records indicate that hundreds of Terran attacks occurred during the war, an extraordinary number that has no parallel in any other Air Force's history. Now, some historians have questioned the precise numbers, and there is genuine debate about how many of the reported Terrans actually occurred versus how many were claimed or exaggerated in the political atmosphere of the time. But the core reality is not in serious dispute. Soviet pilots rammed enemy aircraft repeatedly, in numbers that are startling, and the fact that this was celebrated rather than treated as a sign of systemic failure, the sign that Soviet aircraft lacked sufficient ammunition capacity or reliable weapons, tells you a great deal about the political culture of the Soviet war effort. What does a Terran require of the pilot? It requires him to be willing to die, because while it was possible, in some circumstances, to ram an enemy aircraft and survive, many Terran attacks ended with both planes going down. The pilot was trading his life for the certainty of destroying the enemy. And the reason that trade made sense, within the terrible logic of the Eastern Front, comes back to what we started with. Dying in the cockpit, choosing your own end on your own terms, was in many cases a better option than what awaited below. Viktor Talalikhin is one of the most famous examples. On the night of August 6, 1941, Talalikhin was flying a I-16 on a night intercept mission near Moscow when he engaged a German Heinkel Gage 111 bomber. He attacked the bomber, and when his ammunition was exhausted, he rammed it. The Heinkel went down. Talalikhin managed to bail out and survived. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union the very next day, and his story was immediately turned into propaganda, a model for the kind of self-sacrificing heroism that the Soviet state wanted to promote and that Soviet citizens were supposed to aspire to. But Talalikhin's story has a bitter coda. He continued flying combat missions after his famous Terran. He was killed in action 2 months later, in October 1941. He was 23 years old. His fate was not unusual. The men who performed Terrans and survived often went back into combat immediately, and the attrition rate for Soviet fighter pilots in the early years of the war was devastating. The average combat life expectancy for a Soviet pilot in 1941 and 1942, depending on the front and the conditions, has been estimated by some historians at less than 60 hours of combat flying, though these figures vary widely and the methodology for calculating them is contested. What is not contested is that Soviet pilots died in enormous numbers, that their replacements were often badly undertrained, and that the culture of the Air Force in those years was shaped by the knowledge that death was extremely likely and that how you died mattered. The political dimension of how you died was not incidental. It was central. Stalin's regime needed heroes. It needed stories of men who chose to die fighting rather than surrendering to the fascists, who charged into the enemy rather than retreating, who embodied the Soviet values of collective sacrifice and revolutionary courage. The Terran was the perfect symbol for this kind of propaganda, and it was used relentlessly. But there is something uncomfortable underneath the propaganda, something that the celebrations of Terran heroism tend to obscure. The fact that so many Soviet pilots were in the position of having exhausted their ammunition and needing to ram an enemy aircraft is partly a reflection of the inadequacy of their weapons and aircraft. The I-16 carried relatively light armament. Soviet aircraft in the early war years had persistent problems with weapons jamming in the cold. The ammunition capacity of many Soviet fighters was limited. These were systemic failures, failures of design and production and supply, that put pilots in positions where the Terran became necessary. Celebrating the Terran as heroism served, among other things, to avoid a difficult conversation about why Soviet pilots were so often running out of ammunition in the first place. Now, let's talk about the experience of going down in more concrete terms. because it is one thing to describe the political and military context that made bailing out over German territory so dangerous. It is another to try to put yourself in the cockpit. Imagine you are a Soviet fighter pilot in the summer of 1942. You are flying on the southern sector of the Eastern Front, somewhere over the vast, flat, open steppe of Ukraine or the Don region. The Germans are advancing. The situation on the ground is desperate. Your unit has been flying multiple sorties a day. The aircraft are not always fully maintained. The replacement pilots are sometimes arriving with barely any combat training, and you have already seen several of your friends go down in the past few weeks. Today you are flying as part of a flight of 4, escorting Il-2 ground attack aircraft on a strike against a German armored column. The Il-2, the Sturmovik, is the aircraft the Germans called the Black Death, a heavily armored, slow, devastating ground attack plane that needed fighter escort desperately because it was easy prey for Bf-109s when unprotected. The attack goes in, but there are German fighters up, Bf-109s, probably from one of the Jagdgeschwader units operating on this sector, come down out of the sun. Your flight leader calls a warning, but too late. The fight becomes a chaos of turning, climbing, diving aircraft, and in the confusion you take hits. The engine begins to lose power. Smoke, maybe fire. You are at low altitude because you came down for the attack. You look out the cockpit. Below you is open steppe, and you can see, in the middle distance, a cluster of vehicles that you know from experience are German transport columns. There are no trees to hide in, no partisan-held forest. The ground below is flat, open, and occupied. You have maybe 40 seconds to decide. You could bail out, the parachute would work. You would land and the Germans would find you within minutes, because you would be completely visible on that flat steppe and there is no way to hide or run. Then comes everything we have already described: the interrogation, the camp, the odds against survival. Or you could try to nurse the aircraft back, but the engine is gone or going. The controls feel wrong. You are losing altitude. The plane may not make it back to Soviet lines, which are many kilometers away in the wrong direction. Or there is a third option. There are German vehicles below. There is a burning aircraft. You understand the math. This is not a hypothetical. This scenario, in various forms, played out hundreds and perhaps thousands of times across the Eastern Front. And the men who faced it were not making irrational decisions when they chose to go in with the aircraft rather than bail out. They were making a cold-eyed calculation about probabilities and outcomes, shaped by everything they knew about what the Germans did with Soviet prisoners and what the Soviet state did with men who came back from German captivity. There is a name for the specific choice to use the aircraft as a weapon in a ground attack at the moment of going down. The Soviets called it the fiery ram, Ognenny Terran, and it was the ground equivalent of the aerial Terran. A pilot whose aircraft was fatally damaged and who was over enemy positions might deliberately fly it into a high-value target, an ammunition dump, a headquarters building, a cluster of vehicles, a bridge. He was dying anyway. He might as well take something valuable with him. There are documented, verified cases of Soviet pilots doing exactly this. The story of Nikolai Gastello, though complicated by subsequent historical controversy over exactly what happened, became the canonical example. Gastello was a bomber pilot whose aircraft was reportedly hit by anti-aircraft fire and set on fire on June 26, 1941, just days after the invasion began. The official account, which became one of the most famous stories of the Soviet war effort, held that Gastello deliberately flew his burning plane into a German motorized column rather than bail out. The story was immediately turned into legend. Gastello became a hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. His name was given to schools, streets, military units, a village. His act was presented as the ideal of Soviet courage and sacrifice, the model of how a Soviet airman should die. Hundreds of subsequent similar acts were reported and celebrated throughout the war, and Soviet wartime media ensured that every Soviet citizen knew about them. The historical reality of Gastello's specific act has been questioned. In the 1990s, when Soviet archives became more accessible, some researchers suggested that the aircraft that had actually performed the fiery ram that day may have been a different crew, and that the details of the Gastello story had been shaped by the propaganda needs of the moment, rather than purely by the facts. This kind of revision is not surprising. Wartime propaganda always involves selection and simplification. What it does not undermine is the broader pattern. Soviet pilots did perform fiery rams. It happened. The specific details of individual cases may be uncertain, but the phenomenon was real. Why was the propaganda so effective? Partly because it aligned with genuine reality. The celebration of men who went down fighting rather than surrendering resonated with Soviet soldiers because they knew, from direct experience or from the testimony of returned soldiers and pilots, that surrendering was not a safe option. The propaganda did not have to invent the danger of surrender. The danger was real. It amplified and shaped a response to a genuine situation. But the propaganda also served the system's interests in ways that had nothing to do with the actual welfare of Soviet airmen. Celebrating men who died rather than being captured helped suppress discussion of the catastrophic early losses, the systemic failures of equipment and training and tactics that were getting people killed in such enormous numbers. It made the deaths meaningful within a political framework, rather than exposing them as the results of policy failures. And it made it psychologically harder for surviving pilots to question whether bailing out might sometimes be the more rational choice, because to question that was to question the heroism of all the men who had gone down fighting. The pressure was not only from above, it came from within units, from the culture of the air forces themselves. A pilot who bailed out over German territory and then somehow made it back to his unit would face questions. Where had he been? Who had he talked to? What had he told the Germans? Even if his captivity had been brief, even if he had said nothing, the fact of having been in German hands was enough to create suspicion. The NKVD had investigators attached to many military units whose job was precisely to interrogate returned prisoners and investigate whether they had collaborated. We know, from the testimonies of survivors and from the memoirs of pilots who wrote after the war, that this atmosphere of suspicion was real and that it affected decisions in the cockpit. Men who had seen colleagues come back from brief captivity or from behind enemy lines and then face interrogation, possible punishment, possible transfer to penal units, understood what the system was telling them. The system was telling them that coming back from German territory was itself suspicious, that the safest path was not to put yourself in a position where you had to explain where you had been. This is a particularly dark aspect of the story, because it means the Soviet state was, in effect, penalizing its own airmen for surviving. A man who bailed out cleanly, evaded German capture, reached partisan forces, and was eventually returned to his unit, had survived something genuinely extraordinary and had demonstrated exactly the kind of resourcefulness and determination the war effort needed. But instead of being celebrated for that survival, he often faced interrogation, suspicion, and the cloud of having spent time in German-held territory. There were units and commanders who were more humane about this than others. The Soviet military was not a monolith, and individual commanders had significant latitude in how they treated their men. Some combat commanders pushed back against NKVD investigators, protecting returned pilots from the worst of the institutional suspicion, vouching for their loyalty based on their combat records. But this required the commander to be willing to put his own neck on the line, and not all of them were. The consequences of the system extended beyond individual units. At the strategic level, the refusal of Soviet pilots to bail out over enemy territory, combined with the brutal rates of attrition in the early war years, created a severe shortage of experienced pilots. Experience in aerial combat accumulates only over time, and a pilot who has survived 50 combat sorties is exponentially more valuable than one who has flown 5. When experienced pilots went down and died rather than surviving as prisoners who might eventually be exchanged or escape, the Soviet Air Force was losing irreplaceable human capital. The Germans had a similar problem, actually, though for different reasons. The Luftwaffe's practice of flying its best aces continuously, rather than rotating them to training duties, meant that many of its most experienced pilots were killed or captured as the war turned against Germany. But the Soviet problem was more acute in the early years, because the losses were so catastrophic and because the disincentives to survive were so strong. There is an important nuance here that needs to be addressed. Not all Soviet pilots refused to bail out. Not all of them performed Terrans. Many bailed out when they had the opportunity, especially as the war went on and the front lines stabilized somewhat, making survival behind enemy lines more plausible in some sectors. The picture is not one of universal suicidal heroism. It is a picture of men making rational calculations under extreme pressure, sometimes calculating that bailing out gave them a reasonable chance of survival, sometimes calculating that it did not. The geography mattered enormously. A pilot going down over a densely populated area close to a German garrison had very different odds than a pilot going down over a forest in an area where partisan activity was strong. A pilot in 1944, when the war had turned decisively in the Soviets' favor, and when large areas of previously occupied territory were being liberated, had different calculations than a pilot in 1941 or 1942, when the front lines were deep inside Soviet territory, and German control over the occupied areas was at its most intense. The aircraft also mattered. A pilot who had been hit but whose aircraft was still flying, who might be able to nurse it back to friendly territory, faced a different calculation than one whose plane was already going down. Pokrishkin and Kozhedub and the other great aces of the Soviet Air Force survived partly through extraordinary skill, yes, but also through a combination of calculated risk-taking that maximized their chances of getting back to friendly territory when damaged, rather than going down over enemy ground. Let us talk for a moment about the Lend-Lease aircraft, because they are an underappreciated part of this story. The United States and Britain supplied the Soviet Union with thousands of aircraft through the Lend-Lease program during the war, including P-39 Airacobras, P-40 Warhawks, Spitfires, and Hurricanes. These aircraft had characteristics that were sometimes different from Soviet types, and the Airacobra in particular became a favorite of Pokrishkin, who flew it extensively during some of his most successful combat periods. But there was another, less celebrated aspect of Lend-Lease aircraft that affected the bailout question. American and British aircraft came with different cockpit designs, including, in many cases, more reliable and easier to operate ejection mechanisms and parachute systems than many Soviet types. The technical reliability of the survival equipment mattered. A pilot who knew with certainty that pulling the ripcord would result in a clean bailout was in a different position than one flying an aircraft where the canopy release mechanism might jam under stress or where the parachute had not been properly repacked or inspected. Soviet ground crews were, in general, extraordinarily dedicated and skilled given their resources and conditions. But the resources were not always adequate, and the pressure of maintaining aircraft through brutal winters and constant operations meant that survival equipment was not always in perfect condition. This is another of those mundane, systemic factors that contributed to the pattern we are examining without being visible in any individual story. Now let's look at some of the specific incidents and individuals whose stories illuminate the larger picture in ways that statistics cannot. Lydia Litviak deserves attention here because her story adds a dimension to this account that would otherwise be missing. Litviak was one of a relatively small number of Soviet women who flew combat missions during the war, and she became the most successful female fighter pilot in history, with 12 confirmed aerial victories. She flew on the Southern Front, including during the brutal battles around Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943. Litviak's story is remarkable for many reasons, but for our purposes, what matters is what happened to her. On August 1st, 1943, she was engaged in combat near the village of Krasny Luch in the Donetsk region. Her Yak-1 was hit and she went down. She was 21 years old. Her body was not found for decades. Because she was listed as missing in action rather than killed, and because missing in action on the Eastern Front carried the same political suspicion as capture, she was denied the Hero of the Soviet Union award for many years. It was only in 1990, more than 4 decades after her death, that she was officially recognized with the award, after physical evidence confirmed that she had been killed in action rather than captured or having survived. The injustice of this is striking. Litviak was one of the most skilled and courageous pilots the Soviet Union produced, and the political system that she served with her life denied her recognition for decades because it could not distinguish between death in combat and the equally feared possibility of capture. Her story is an extreme case, but it reflects a broader truth. The stigma of capture and the suspicion attached to time behind enemy lines were powerful enough to shape not just the decisions of living pilots, but the posthumous treatment of dead ones. Then there is Alexei Marasyev, whose story is perhaps the most extraordinary of all, and whose name is less well known in the West than it deserves to be. In April 1942, Marasyev's Yak-1 was shot down over the Novgorod region of northwestern Russia, in the deep forest near the village of Staraya Russa. He survived the crash but was badly injured, with both legs damaged. He spent 18 days in the forest, crawling towards Soviet lines, surviving on berries and bark and whatever he could find, occasionally helped by local villagers, before finally being found and evacuated. Both of his legs were amputated below the knee. He was fitted with prosthetics, and then, in one of the most improbable comebacks in military history, he trained himself to fly again, learned to work the aircraft's foot pedals with prosthetic limbs, and returned to combat flying in 1943. He went on to shoot down 7 more German aircraft after his amputation, bringing his total to 11 confirmed victories. Moresiev's story was the basis for a famous Soviet novel and film, The Story of a Real Man, which made him a national hero and became a touchstone of Soviet wartime culture. But there is something in his story that goes beyond the inspirational biography. His 18-day ordeal in the forest, his absolute refusal to give up even while crawling through snow on destroyed legs, was in part made possible by the fact that he had gone down in Soviet-held or at least neutral territory. He was not behind German lines. He was in a contested region where, with enormous effort and suffering and luck, survival was possible. Moresiev's story shows what Soviet pilots were capable of when the geography worked in their favor, when the effort to survive and return was not immediately negated by capture or the fear of what coming back would mean for their status. It also implicitly illuminates the contrast. In German-held territory, those 18 days of crawling would most likely have ended with discovery, capture, and death. The mathematics of survival in the forest behind Soviet lines was different from the mathematics of survival in the open steppe behind German lines. We also need to discuss the role of unit culture and personal relationships, because the story of why Soviet pilots refused to bail out is not only a story about political pressure from above, it is also a story about bonds between men, about loyalty to comrades, about the way that the culture of a fighter regiment shaped the decisions of individual pilots. Soviet fighter aviation was organized around regiments, typically composed of multiple squadrons. Within these regiments, the pilots who survived long enough to build experience formed tight bonds. They knew each other, they had fought together, they had attended the informal memorials for those who had gone down. In some units, particularly as the war went on, and a corps of experienced pilots survived long enough to become genuine veterans, these bonds were deep and formative. A pilot in such a unit understood that his survival was connected to the survival of his comrades. If you went down over German territory, you were not just losing your own life. You might be losing a pair leader whose experience had kept his wingman alive. You might be losing a flight commander who had held the unit together through impossible conditions. The loss was collective, not just individual. This created pressure from the side, not just from above. There was an unspoken expectation that if you could avoid going down, you would. Not because the state demanded it, not because you were afraid of NKVD interrogation, but because your comrades needed you to come back. The culture of the best Soviet fighter regiments was intensely focused on bringing everyone home, on tactics that protected wingmen, on maximizing the chance that experienced pilots would survive to fly again. This culture also meant that the decision to perform a Taran or a fiery ram was not only a political statement or a response to fear of capture. Sometimes it was a tactical decision, a way of destroying something valuable when no other means were available. Pokrishkin's framework of height, speed, maneuver, fire was about maximizing kills while minimizing losses, not about heroic self-sacrifice. The best Soviet pilots were not trying to die gloriously. They were trying to win. And sometimes, given the situation, the options for winning required choices that most pilots in other air forces were not expected to make. Now let's talk about the later years of the war, because the picture changes significantly as the conflict evolves. By 1943, and certainly by 1944, the situation of the Soviet Air Force was fundamentally different from what it had been in 1941. The Soviet aircraft industry had been successfully relocated east of the Urals and was producing aircraft in enormous numbers. New models, the Yak-3, the La-7, the La-5FN, were genuinely competitive with, or even superior to the best German fighters. Training had improved. The tactical doctrine had been reformed. The experienced pilots who had survived 1941 and 1942 had become a formidable cadre of veterans. Pokrishkin and Kozhedub were flying in these later years, achieving many of their victories in 1943 and 1944, a reflection of both their own accumulated skill and the improved quality of their aircraft and the air force around them. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was being ground down by attrition on multiple fronts. The quality gap between Soviet and German aviation, which had been enormous in 1941, had narrowed dramatically by 1944. In this changed environment, the bailout calculation shifted somewhat. As the front lines moved west and as Soviet forces liberated more and more territory, the geography of survival changed. Areas that had been deep in German-held territory in 1942 were now either liberated or within reach of partisan networks. The likelihood of a pilot coming down in territory where survival and eventual return to Soviet lines was possible increased. But some things did not change. The institutional culture of suspicion around returned prisoners and those who had spent time behind enemy lines persisted. Order 270 was never officially rescinded. The NKVD continued to investigate returned prisoners throughout the war. The stigma of capture continued to shape decisions in the cockpit, even as the strategic situation improved. There is a fascinating and disturbing phenomenon that historians have documented from the later war years. As Soviet forces began liberating territory that had been under German occupation, and as some Soviet POWs were freed from German camps, these men were immediately placed in what were effectively Soviet filtration camps, where they were interrogated about their time in German